Welcome, everyone, to our next episode of Seeing Opportunity in Devastation and sharing stories to inspire you to prosper despite the devastation. And last week, we started a series, and it has been sharing, particularly based on the question as to how you rate as an effective salesperson directed at entrepreneurs in general. We've published a podcast entitled Episode 20 Skills of a Great Salesperson. You're welcome to go and access that in the YouTube channel Griffin Enterprise Development. And in that podcast, it outlined the first, I guess, foundation as far as managerial skills are concerned. So over to you, Ed, as part two kicks off this afternoon.
Thanks, Jacques, and hello to everyone. This series is actually a little bit broader than selling. This is directed squarely at entrepreneurs who might themselves be doing the selling, and often will be, but may also simply be driving the train with the sales force or some kind of other channel that does the real hard sell. So it is more talking about entrepreneurial success than pure selling, although selling will be a part of it along the line, because unfortunately, success and selling are inextricably entwined. If you don't sell, you don't have success. If you sell, you generally will have success. It's difficult to have one without the other. So, what we talked about last week was the pure skills of management. Everything from the basic stuff like time management and crisis management and project management to the more esoteric skills like people management and leadership and some of the others. And when I reflected on what we had talked about last week, particularly on the field of leadership, we gave several examples of how do you know if you're a leader, because pretty well everyone running their own business thinks that they're a great leader. They may simply be a tyrant who provides employment, and everyone says, yes, sir, because jobs are scarce and nobody's going to threaten their livelihood at this stage by being anything other than subservient to someone who demands subservience. That, I guess, is one form of leadership, and there have been numerous dictators and tyrants and monarchs and so on around the world who have exercised that form of leadership, and not a few business people. But it's very difficult to maintain that style. There's an awful lot of those tyrants around the world who were assassinated or dethroned or toppled or um, buried under revolutions and interesting things like the guillotine were invented specifically to manage those sort of situations. So maybe it's not the most desirable leadership style in all the world. But I had a look at leadership, and the thing we didn't discuss, we said a lot of these categories might have themselves subcategories. And leadership is one of those where I think, yes, there are a number of subcategories to leadership that we can consider. So let's just take the first one, which is inspiring and motivating. So leaders in general, great leaders, will generally inspire people to believe in a particular direction, to follow them in a particular direction, to dedicate themselves to a cause in a particular direction. And we can all think of the sort of leaders that have produced those kind of followings where they will literally do anything. They will die for the business. there are many examples in the sporting world of great leaders who would inspire their teammates to do anything, sacrifice anything, just to be a part of their team. And so there are in many workplaces. I think the Virgin Group has a number of examples of very similar situations. Microsoft, especially in its early days, they had people working 72 hours at a stretch just because they wanted to, not because they were even asked or suggested to, but because they believed fanatically in the cause. Several of the IT companies have had similar situations, and so is the case in buildings and in armies and in political environments and everywhere else. So, inspiration is a key component, and motivation is a key component of inspiration as well. Are the people inspired and motivated to follow? And then, what about providing direction, telling people where they're going? A number of people who are seen as leaders are actually a bit directionless. And you see this frequently in politics, for instance, where the leader is leading, but their direction seems very uncertain. It may be a sort of anti some other um, style of government leadership. We see this in where there's a conflict between socialist and capitalist economies, where many leaders will simply be anti the other side. It happens in the military quite extensively, where the leadership is simply anti the enemy. They don't provide a particular direction. And people who, even if they are inspired and motivated, but they don't understand the direction, the big picture, are really great followers because they will finally start wondering why they're there. And, if we go back to some examples, I recently read some accounts of the First World War. And there were people who were 14 and 15 who pretended to be 18 so that they could go and do their bit for their country, their king and their country. And they died in their tens of thousands at times. They were put into areas they could where they were absolutely certain that the majority of them would die in the middle of an assault, and they still ran forward. They were absolutely provided with a direction they believed was the right cause, and they would do anything to support that cause. Same is true in some businesses, same is true in some religions, and many other similar examples. So this is a dimension of leadership that we should not ignore. And what about guiding? So telling people how to get there. It's all very well saying that's the objective, that's the enemy. Take that hill. And if you need to die doing so, well, so be it. Providing guidance along the line. And a huge characteristic of leadership is often strength in adversity. So leadership tends to be reasonably not simple, but easier when things are going well. Because people are keen to get behind you because it looks like things are going well. And therefore, you are doing something right. But what about when things go very, very badly wrong? There, the leader, the true leader, must come out into his own and show strength through adversity. Once again, if we look at examples through history, I think Winston Churchill was a wonderful example. He actually stood and said, I can offer you nothing but blood and sweat and tears and so on. And there's a beautiful quotation of that, which I've forgotten the full part of it. But nevertheless, people were flocking to do whatever he said. So he was showing this immense strength in adversity, and he was showing the characteristic, the next one, which was leading by example, doing it to lead you, to show people that this is possible. There have been so many wonderful examples of leading by example, of people who have done what has to be done, who will take the lowest job and do it to show that it can be done and will be done and must be done, who will inspire by leading by example and acknowledging people. Once again, many of the tyrants, they don't acknowledge anybody. They believe they have it all themselves. They know it all. They are the only success factor in the business or enterprise or army or whatever it is. And they don't acknowledge anybody else. But great leaders do acknowledge. Often they will be the person when they are congratulated on their successes. They will first acknowledge the people around them and how they contributed towards the success, rather than simply saying, I'm great, I did it all. So, those are some dimensions just of the quality of leadership, and that was one of the 10 areas that we said of managerial ability. So, this matrix can get quite broad. And let's just reiterate what we're talking about here. We're saying that we're going to pick about 8 or 9 qualities that, if you were good at all of them, really good at all of them, you are likely to be a highly successful entrepreneur, business leader, salesperson, sales manager, or whatever. So each of these will be broken down into subsections. And the one we dealt with last week was managerial competencies. And one of those was leadership, which probably should have been a separate category. And each of those may be broken down into individual ones. And the whole idea, if you can visualize a matrix of, say, 8 or 9 qualities of entrepreneurial excellence, and each one of those has between 5 and maybe 10 qualities that contribute towards those. And if each of those subsections are rated on a star system, just as you would rate your B&B or whatever, on a 1 to 5 star system, and those 5 to 10 sub qualities are then averaged to give you a score for that particular competency. Once you do it all, your overall rating, if your overall rating, and you've been honest with yourself, is now 4.7 or 4.8, hey, then don't do anything. You're great. You're doing well. Just focus on banking all the money. But for for most of us, we have deficiencies in our makeup. We have things that we are doing wrong. And since we always strive to achieve, this whole idea of this series is to provide you with those areas where you could improve. There's no sense in just patting you on the back for all the areas where you're the greatest. We want to show you where you could improve, because by doing that, you can improve as an entrepreneur, as a salesman, as a whatever, and in so doing, improve your profitability, your growth, your vision, your scalability, and all the other categories that you might aspire to. And once we get a little bit further, we'll actually publish a little graph, a little chart, which will allow you to tick off these subcategories and perhaps even sub-subcategories, and rate yourself. And you might want to add or subtract some from this chart and see whether they are applicable to you. So that was leadership. That just touched on what we had done last week. And this week I want to start on the whole question of staff. How good are you at selecting, retaining, and motivating staff? Because unless you're a very small business with two or three people, if you're a business of any size at all, then the business is highly developed, highly dependent on the people within it. And that means that if the people within it aren't motivated and the right people and don't work together and all of that kind of thing, that the business will be very badly held back. Our colleague, Mr. Steve Swartz, who Jacques and I know very well, he gives the example of a bit of research that was done that showed that a horse pulling a cart, if the horse pulling the cart was joined by a second horse pulling the cart, the second horse pulling the cart added to the first horse could not carry twice the load of one horse. It in fact only could carry 1.5 times the load. If we added another two horses to make it a four-horse team, they couldn't carry 4 times the load. They could only carry about 2 times the load of the single horse. So sometimes the more people put into a team, the less progressive, the less effective it becomes in terms of inputs, in terms of their cost of the people that go into it. So getting staff to work correctly or getting horses to pull the right way is very important. The theory behind the horse example is that the first horse says, "Oh, well, I've got someone alongside me now. I don't have to pull as hard as I used to drag this wagon along." And the more horses that join, the more that effect happens. And the same thing probably happens with people. So let's just take the start of this because we're not going to be able to finish it today. But if you're looking at staff retention, then surely choosing right is a key component of that. How good are you at choosing the right staff for the job? And uh, I'm a firm believer that the best is not always the best one for you. If we refer to rugby as an example, then our national rugby director, Rassie Erasmus, has as an absolute credo the best player for a position is not necessarily the best player for the team. You want the right player for the team. So he often will reject the best player in a particular position and choose the right player for that position. And this in coaching and in business and in many other environments is a very common way of thinking, and one which I fully support. You need to choose the right people for the job, which are not necessarily the shining stars. In fact, the shining stars may be a disadvantage to your business if they don't work with their colleagues. So choosing right, how good are you? How many times have you chosen and when you get them, not really what they lived up to be? They don't perform as well as they do. And one of the measures of that is what's your level of staff retention? What's the level of staff churn? How often do people leave? How often do they quit? How often do they search for other jobs while they're working for you? It's a great measure that. Do you know that measure? Do you know what the answer is to staff churn? What proportion of your staff leaves in any one period? And is that a particular segment of your staff? Do they all come from production or admin or sales? Or is it across the board? And is it a particular segment by length of service? Is it the new people leaving or the older people leaving or both? These are simple numbers that every business manager should have at the top of their mind, because you're totally dependent on your staff. Now, if you don't know those sort of numbers, you really don't have a clue of what's happening within your staff. And if you do have those numbers, you can perhaps compare with similar organizations and similar departments, and perhaps national statistics, which will give you those kind of bits of information. So, this is a key aspect. The next key aspect is killing ceilings. There's nothing that demotivates people more than knowing that they are going to reach a ceiling, and that's as far as they're ever going to grow in this organization. It may be that they don't have any ambitions beyond that ceiling, and I guess there are many that are like that. But it's sad when people realize that that's as far as they're going to go. We're almost back in the dreadful old days of apartheid, where if you were a worker on a shop floor, that's the best you ever going to be. Maybe you would get to be a shift boss, but that's about the best you ever going to be. And there's so many of those workers, even today, 30 years on, that started in those positions and just stayed in those positions. They didn't grow. They weren't encouraged to grow. They weren't developed. They saw they were never going to sit in the corner office. And so they just stayed there. Now they're at retirement age, and they're still on a worker's wage, and they have no provision for their old age. Kill the ceilings. The ladies went through an awful lot of pain and still go through a lot of pain about glass ceilings. Not a thing that should be doing anything to us at the moment. And the next one, and probably we're not going to have time to talk about that today, but discipline and, if necessary, termination. Someone once said, a good measure of your managerial skills is how many people you have personally terminated, told them that they are no longer in the business. It's a very tough thing to do, very tough. Uh, we all love people, but it is part of the whole staff thing. You can have someone in the organization that's an absolute cancer, and if you don't cut it out, your organization may suffer. Jacques, I think I've just about talked out our time now. Am I correct?
More or less, Ed. I mean, as you point out, is I think to start anything new within the time available,
Yeah.
we'll have to then amputate midway. So, but thank you, Ed, for that. That's actually quite brilliant. And to your point, we actually, from what I understand from you, is that we're looking at uh, this sort of questionnaire checklist is encouraging entrepreneurs to understand where they're at as far as all this criteria is concerned. So number one, I immediately think about, oh, the entrepreneur is an all-rounder. But this does not mean you have to do everything in your business. But you got to know what your strengths are. You got to know where you lack, and you then, especially now when we're talking about selecting the right kind of staff, is to complement those areas where you lack, for example. And it was quite interesting is that it actually also takes discipline not to want to go for the cream of the crop all the time. The stars out there, because we believe we need to attach ourselves to stars, and that will necessarily um, really revolutionize our business. But to your point, is choosing the right people for the job, and it's not about just choosing from the cream of the crop. And I was just thinking about the other thing that you mentioned is lastly, I think the last thing, talking about discipline and talking about termination. I mean, many times when we use the big word discipline, it is just holding people accountable to the expectations in their functions. That's number one, and making sure that you have that conversation. And then, I find that when it comes to teams and employees in an organization, one of the things that we don't necessarily always check for is there really values alignment? Because there's one thing where someone performs, but always on the lookout for other things, but their heart, their soul, the passion that you spoke about is not there. So it's just a job, right? And sometimes when there's a big values clash, also in a business, where the all the means justifies the end. So it does not matter how business is developed, um, except that the bottom line is being looked after. If you have staff that are not aligned to your own values, that could also potentially cause problems. So, but yes, having the courage to terminate when you see that,
And
pruning your
Jacques,
business is critical.
Just to butt in there, sorry, but so often discipline goes wrong because staff are held to account for functions which have not been very clearly explained to them. So they are held accountable for the sort of unsaid parts of the job that are in the manager's mind but not expressed in the terms of reference. That they should be of this type, they should want to work extra hours, but those aren't in the terms of reference. And that's so unfair. We can only hold people to account if we've told them what we're going to hold them to account for.
Absolutely. So that one, it swings both ways. Number one, if it's clear, hold people accountable and don't be afraid to hold them accountable. But if you haven't communicated clearly what your expectations are, as you say, it's then unfair. And that also leads to all kinds of unfair practices, and then in itself becomes a ceiling to the career path as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But our time is completely up, and thank you very much, Ed, for that installment. And as we will continue next week, as we build on this, I think we kind of building a framework of what an all-round performance looks like in a business, and then how do you step up into that space, and how you recruit into that space to build this all-round picture. In any way, that's how I'm inspired by it. So thanks, Ed. Thanks to those that have joined us this afternoon as well. We look forward to the next installment. Enjoy the rest of the week further. Keep warm even during load shedding. Bye for now.